So I want to welcome everyone to this next edition of the Humpty Project, where I'm joined by Jessica Oladapo. Jessica is a sociologist and social justice worker and mother of three amazing kids. She's a professor. Four.
Sure.
Did I totally lost count.
Yeah, I think two of them are always merged together. The big two are merged together.
I haven't seen them for like 8 years.
Uh-huh.
Ah, well, I got to know Jessica about 11 years ago. She's a professor, teacher, and trainer as well. And she has a certificate in diversity and inclusion from Cornell University. And she has her own business, Diversity to Inclusion. And what she's focusing on there, and we'll talk about, is working with groups developing intercultural teams, focusing on psychological safety and belonging. So, in a moment, I'm going to allow Jessica to take the floor and talk about her efforts in the world of DEI, if you will. I want to mention, though, that Jessica, I met her 11 years ago, I'd say, in Rockford, Illinois. And she's one of the inspirations for why I started the Humpty Project. Early on, when I was on a planning committee with ECIA, I proposed Jessica as she was starting her business and her journey outside of academia in diversity to inclusion. Introduced her to ECIA. She was not selected to be one of the speakers on diversity and inclusion. And I thought at that time that only people that looked like Jessica, women of color, could speak on this topic. And it would be years later that I felt like I was doing the topic disservice by not using my voice, not certainly as somebody who has any learned experience as a woman or as a person of color, but as somebody who's on the other side of the glass ceiling and somebody who wants to bring about and affect change and wants to be more than just an influencer, but somebody who's actually making a difference. And I can go on and on about all of that. So the reason I started the Humpty Project in large part was to introduce different voices to my network of people, different voices that they may not be exposed to. And we're not here to try to educate the entire world. There's going to be people where this doesn't resonate. It's way too woke for some people. Oh, it's woke. Um,
Mhm.
but there are people, I've met them. There's people in my industry, older men, older white men, men who are sitting in positions of power, making decisions about who works with them, who works for them, how their companies are organized. And there's a lot of people on the sideline that I think are curious and want to know more. So Jessica, tell us about your journey and take it from here.
Yeah. So my journey, as you mentioned, I'm a sociologist and psychologist by trade. And my journey has been exciting, but also this is not at all where I thought that where I would land, right?
Okay.
Um, I have been a sociologist and teaching sociology in higher education since 2009. And I was extremely comfortable in teaching sociology to the captive audience, students who needed to take sociology classes for their general education requirements. And then once they got a little taste of it, decided to take other classes like social problems and sociology of the family. And my one of my passions, the race and ethnic relations course. Um, and so they would take the introduction to social class as a requirement and then continue on and oftentimes take all of the sociology offerings. As such, I developed really great relationships with students and also faculty members and other folks in the community who, by 2015, were coming to me asking, do you mind having those sorts of conversations at my workplace or at my kids' school or
Right.
in various places? And, of course, I was initially like, no, I don't want to do that. I'm very comfortable in the classroom. But the very first conversation that I agreed to do was with a police department in northern Illinois, very near Iowa, very close to Iowa. Uh, and I was kind of scared out of my mind, right? My
Right.
first diversity conversation is in a very rural white space. and as a Black girl from the city of Chicago, um, that was a kind of a culture shock. And
I would
also,
imagine so.
yeah, and also there were folks in the room who felt like I was speaking about this topic from a space of personal interest. That the reason why I was having this conversation was my experience as a Black woman was somehow defined by hardship, and it hasn't been.
Okay.
And so that was a point of awareness for me, right? That like sometimes when people see me engaging in this conversation, they think that it's related to like a personal hardship or some racialized trauma. And don't get me wrong, there is of course racialized trauma because of the way that socialization operates. There is gender trauma related to the way socialization operates, but definitely I have a great deal of privilege. After all, I was a 30 something year old tenured college professor by that time.
Right.
And so I had that experience, and it really forced me to think about the way that I was having that conversation in that moment. And I would actually um, believe and argue that even now I'm still on this journey, right, of learning how to best serve people and what is it that people need. So at the time I started with a conversation about, implicit bias and very in a
Right.
very academic way. And over time I came to realize that there is some benefit to engaging in that conversation in an academic way in certain settings. But also, if I come into a room and I begin to have a conversation where I'm defining implicit bias and I immediately go to everyone has biases, what
Right.
does that do from a psychological perspective? People aren't able to hear anything else that I've said in the next 3 hours or for the next 3 months or however long I'm contracted to have the conversation, because the amygdala gets tripped and the fight flight freeze or appease mechanism kicks into gear, and people are either ready to fight usually, or they're ready to freeze. And so I began to have the conversation differently over the last couple of years, kind of beginning with, well, people have an innate biological need of belonging. It's Everyone does. And so it is in the interest of groups to ensure that belonging happens. How do we do that? We do that first by ensuring psychological safety. So ensuring that these conversations can be had. So putting things in place so that there is psychological safety, so that we can begin to have conversations about belonging. So then we can have conversations about race and gender and sexual orientation and age and ageism and ability and disability and the whole range of human diversity.
I've been writing notes here. There's quite a lot that I could
There's a lot.
branch off into. And I'm notorious for speaking too much. One of the things I'm trying to learn is active listening and not waiting for my turn to talk, but actually having something meaningful to say and really engaging and learning from what that person says. It sounds like you've recognized that there's a lot of discomfort and immediate biases. So somebody sees you, am I right to say that somebody sees you and assumes you're a Black woman, so you must have had some sort of traumatic experience. You must not like police officers. Is that
Oh,
basically what you felt?
absolutely. Absolutely. And I've had, a couple of years ago, it's interesting. I did a training, 2 day, 3 hour each day training with police officers. And again, I start with belonging, and um, I give like kid stories and I talk about my
Right,
dog. And
right.
one of the it was fascinating to me. Someone left feedback and they said the only thing that she talked about was race. And I
Uh,
was like, wow, that
that's
is,
all they could hear, I guess,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, but what's interesting, because we I know how the brain works, right? The person perceived me, they developed a narrative, and so everything they heard from my mouth was filtered through the narrative that they had created. Um, and so then it was difficult for them to even hear a funny story about my puppy without filtering that through a lens of race. And
Right.
it's interesting because for some people, they will hear the same exact conversation and they will say, the only thing she talked about was gender. And then other people will say, she talked about her kids for the whole time, right? In the same exact um, conversation. What that did for me was it allowed me again to recognize the importance of relationship building. So then it is my hope that when people come into sessions with me, or when people have coaching sessions, whether it's a coaching session or a training session or even a therapy session, that I am building a relationship with them such that they are not just filtering what I'm saying through a lens of, some demographic
Right.
information that they perceive.
It's interesting because for me, I tend to, and part of it, I think, is being a man, we're generally encouraged to use our voices differently.
Mhm,
Part of it may be that I was raised on the East Coast and I have that stereotypical type A, New York, Philadelphia type personality. Uh, you can think of the shock jocks on the radio. Not that I listen to many of them, but I tend to go toward calling out rather than calling in. I've been working on that, and I tend to go for shock value sometimes. And I've been working hard over the years to tone that down because I've learned that people really aren't listening. Then people are
mhm,
not going to listen, and I sometimes chide myself for taking so long to start this mission that I'm on, feeling like you're now 61 years old. You were afraid to use your voice in many social situations in business or in particular meetings because you were afraid you'd be seen differently, judged, maybe passed on for a promotion, maybe kicked out of a conference. Who knows?
mhm,
So there was this fear, and I can't say it's the same sort of fear that others would have, that females or people of color. So I never want to step in and say I know how people feel, but I can say I felt some of that, and I sometimes chide myself for why didn't I take these actions earlier. But you're making me think that possibly, well, I believe somewhat in karma. Everything happens at the right time,
mhm,
and because I have relationships with so many people, they know who I am generally. There's some people who don't know me well, but we've been doing business together, many of us, for 30 to 35 years. And I'm hoping that if I introduce topics well, that people will take the time to listen, even if it's not for the entire podcast. They'll get the gist of things and then eventually tune into more and more of them because I have a relationship with them.
mhm.
So uh, I don't want to necessarily shock people, but I feel like we're at a point where technology is advancing rapidly. The
Yes.
coronavirus and quarantines and um, shuttered businesses and social distancing, it changed the dynamics of work. And I've been following a lot of that, the work from home, the hybrid return to the office. And I'm convinced that we have to reckon this rapid change in technology, AI being the latest that we've seen. We have to reckon that with a rapid change in societal norms too. It just doesn't stand to reason that we could advance as a society with the latest technology changing exponentially without making exponential changes societally.
Mhm,
But at the same time, I want people to be able to feel comfortable listening and hearing this conversation between you and I and the others I've hosted. So that that's really insightful for me, Jessica, because I feel like maybe this is the right time for me. 20 years ago, probably not as many people knew me. I didn't have as much credibility. They might have just said,
Mm-hmm.
I came to the curb. I'm sure there's a bunch of people who think I'm a bit of a kook. And I did an episode a few episodes ago with a woman, and it's called Wear the Damn Earring. And now I've been wearing an earring in business. I had my ear pierced 34 years ago, but I generally refused to wear it because I didn't want to be judged. But I am also all about letting people be within reason their authentic self,
Yep.
because I think that's when they bring their best to the workforce. That's when they contribute the most to the team. And I've seen lots of data about diverse teams are more productive, they're more creative, diverse and inclusive companies are more profitable.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's where I go again to that rapid change. If companies aren't willing to embrace this and they're going to do what some of those people are doing in those trainings you're having, just check the box to say, my people have all watched the DEI course on, mandated by California state law, but they don't really embrace it. I think companies that adopt are going to be able to capture this younger generation, which is generally, you can never put everybody in the same box, but generally a lot more open to these types of discussions.
Yeah. And I'll add that I used to, when I first began, like the business case exists, and I used to feel like, you know, can't we just appeal to people based on based on a common and shared humanity, right? That yes, racism exists, yes, sexism exists, yes, inequities across the board exist. And we can have those conversations and we can appeal to the common humanity of people and get them to like challenge racist, sexist, homophobic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, policies that exist, and then look at the procedures that exist. And we can just do that by appealing to their humanity. And the more I do this work, I still have hope in that, right? And I also know the way to even begin to have that conversation, we have to have a conversation about the business case. We have to have the conversation about um, it increases profits. When people feel as though they belong, they will go over and beyond the call of duty. They will stay, right? Even when we think about like retention rates, we know that there's the quiet quitting,
Right.
but more than quiet quitting, Gen Z, they're not just quiet quitting. Gen Z is like, I am loudly quitting. I am not sticking around. Do I have another job lined up? No, but this job I don't belong, and so I am leaving. And so we know that that's a thing. And the some of the younger millennials as well. I'm also a millennial. I'm called a geriatric millennial. And
Okay.
geriatric millennials, it's so funny these terms, right? But geriatric millennials behave much more like, the Gen X. So we might not feel like we belong, but we'll just continue to work a job and then we'll give less and less and less, and be looking for another job while we're while we're at work, right? So that's the kind of the generational difference. And so if companies want to continue to increase profits and companies are um, um, what's the word? They are pouring into the people that they're hiring, but if they're not also focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, those same people that they have poured into are going to quit. They're not going to stay, right? And so then there's this revolving door. So for me, it is so important to focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as a practice, not just as an initiative, but we have a practice of ensuring that people belong in this space. And if they don't, that's going to impact retention rates, which will then impact profits, which will then impact productivity, right? And then how sustainable is that? And so I do have that conversation now as well, because it's not just the emotionality of it. It really boils down to the bottom line. The bottom line is you're not going to be able to cut it, especially now with the younger millennials and the Gen Z generation saying, nope, I don't, this doesn't feel right. I have a younger brother, and my younger brother is very much like, this doesn't feel right in my spirit. I don't have another job yet, but another jobs come. So, if you're not focusing on belonging, then that's going to impact profit for sure.
I'm totally convinced of that. And I try to put this, if nothing else, this podcasting is helping me be more accountable as a manager of a small group of people, because I do have that natural tendency to think that my exuberance for a project or uh, my vision for something, when shared, people will follow along and want to join me in my mission to, company mission to accomplish something. But really, if I'm not allowing them to use their voice early, they're just waiting for me to tell them what next step to take. And so I'm learning to try to take up less oxygen in the room each time I talk, to try to delegate a lot more than I ever did. So if nothing else, I can influence that small team of people that directly are under my line of responsibility. So I find this to be a blast, because I think we're always learning, and
Mhm.
and and it's very easy to relate to. We all want to belong. I looked at that years ago. I don't know when or why, but everything to me is, we use the term gang in a way of saying, if you belong to a gang, that's a bad thing. But really, everything, almost everybody wants to belong to something. and
Absolutely.
and that's where you went earlier, that you talk about belonging a lot. And I identify really at the core with my very close family members,
Hmm.
and my exercise and the biking or running clubs that I've been involved with over the years. I'm not a faith-based person, so I don't identify with that. Uh, but it does seem we have our hands full on this topic, because there's some people who really have dug their heels into belonging to a what they believe to be a political
Right.
party or philosophy. And a lot of them, dare I say, are just not thinking for themselves. They're just being manipulated by those that are profiting off
Mhm.
their lack of any initiative to go out and do some critical thinking. So I speak from the point of view of I don't want to say a reformed Republican, but I was very much the conservative Republican when I started voting. I was able to vote in the 1980 presidential election, and I was a Reagan Republican, ran for office as a Republican, and was a Republican organizer, and eventually went away from that. Really don't identify party wise anymore. But I see a couple things that cause me to say it's time for me to use my voice. So that sense of belonging. There's certain people I think that dig in on whatever side of the fence, if you call it a fence, that are too entrenched in the whole identity around what they believe to be their politics, that I'm not going to reach them. I'm not trying to reach them. But I also see people like Andrew Tate. Are you familiar with who that person is?
Remind me. I've heard the name.
Yeah, I don't exactly know who he is, quite frankly. He is ex MMA or something. I think he was in
Mhm.
Romania or Bulgaria. He was arrested for some sort of sexual trafficking. He attacked Greta Thunberg a few months ago, showing, smoking a cigar, and, showing how he loves to pollute the planet with all his cars. And I think he's got the most followers on TikTok or Twitter or something like that.
Mhm.
Uh, he's repulsive enough to me that I don't follow him closely enough to say I'm an expert. But, he's your classic. He's your poster boy for toxic masculinity. And when people don't feel like they belong, they will latch on to some of the worst some of the worst tendencies. So that's why I don't lump every younger person in the same bucket. And I'm not necessarily knocking any of these people. They don't feel like anybody has their voice.
Right.
But it alarms me, because I want to show, that's another topic I want to cover, is masculinity, because I think on its own it's a bit of a toxic term, because we associate it just to men, being strong, being able to take care of yourself. I
Mhm.
think women, men, it doesn't matter. We should all have,
Mhm.
as we should recognize our dependency on society, but it also be as independent as we can.
Mhm.
So I do see some alarming trends with belonging as well. But
Hmm.
I agree with you and about the fact that we all want to belong.
Yeah. And I think I think that the alarming trends that you're noticing as it relates to belonging, I don't think that's new. I think that
Yeah.
that's been since, there's one phrase that whenever students write papers and they write since the beginning of time, I'm like, when? What does that mean? But I'm going to say it anyway. Since the beginning of time, humans have had an innate need to belong, and when they don't feel as though they belong, they will, in sociology, we call it, the in groups and the out groups, right? And so people will um, they'll create groups with their own cultures, with their own kind of ideologies. And it reminds me of, in education, sometimes people will say, children, um, they just want attention, which is a good thing, right? I'm not saying that in a negative way. Kids want attention, but also adults want attention as well. How we gain attention is what matters. So if I am behaving in a way that is beneficial to the classroom and I'm ignored, I'm raising my hand, I am following the rules and I'm ignored, then I might begin to engage in maladaptive behaviors in the interest of gaining the attention that all humans want and need, right? And actually, I shouldn't even say want, it is a basic human need,
Right.
right? Need for belonging. And so now I'm behaving in maladaptive ways to get some attention and to feel as though I am seen in this space, and adults do it as well. So then when we see adults engaging in these behaviors that are maladaptive and that are harmful, then we can understand it, not excuse it, but we can understand it as that's a need of belonging. So what is missing, or what need do they have? Sometimes it's a real need. Sometimes it's mental health, right? Sometimes it's basic human needs of food, water, warmth, rest, shelter, right? Sometimes it's that. Well, they'll engage in maladaptive behaviors to get those needs met. But that's been since the beginning of time.
Right. And there's probably some genetic code within us that we realize, even though there were those, and I was one of them, that's when Hillary wrote the book, I guess in the 90s, It Takes a Village. I was like, you know, get out of here with your
Mhm.
nanny state politics kind of attitude. I do realize I couldn't I probably couldn't eat without somebody else. I don't think I could grow. We tried to grow tomatoes in our yard and the squirrels ate, but not us. So
Yeah.
I'm dependent on a lot more people than I wanted to realize
Right.
back then. But early in your introduction here, you told me that people took your class because pretty much they had to. It was
Mhm.
a requirement for their degree, but they chose to take other classes and follow along with you. And then many of them chose to follow along and ask you to come to their places of business or their organizations to talk. And that's one of the reasons I was really eager and excited to talk to you, because I think you have a way of approaching this topic that is not, you know, slap in the face, shake people in the, at their shoulders and get them to listen, uh, but your way of approaching the topic is allowing it to be heard. And there
Mhm.
are those who won't necessarily hear. I know there's some people, they see me and they see me with Amma, and those who don't know me well, but no, Amma, no, she's from African and Filipino descent. They'll assume that that's why I'm so
Mhm.
I don't know biased towards people of
Invested.
color. My
Yeah.
kids
You're
are
so
mixed race.
invested. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so it's like, oh well, I understand why he's that way.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, there's people that are always going to try to quickly judge the book by its cover. But we're coming up to the end of the scheduled time here, so if there's others that are interested in getting in touch with you and saying, hey, come on into my business or tell me more about what you're doing in the business side of diversity to an inclusion, which is, I think, the official name of your business. And I'll share that with people. Tell people what's the best way to get in touch with you and share anything you'd like about your business to wrap up here.
Yep. So the best way to reach me is my website is www.diversity2, the number two, inclusion.org. And then my email is diversity2, again, the number two, inclusion at gmail.com. Those are the best ways to reach me, but I can also be found on Instagram. There are moments that I share more kind of insights and thoughts and videos. I haven't been sharing as much recently because I just graduated last week. So
Congratulations.
thank you. And so I'll go back to sharing more there. But like I said, the best way to reach me is through my website. On the website, also, I have videos that I've created over the past couple of years about the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And they're called the moment of pause. So, pause stands for practice, accountability, understanding, sympathy, and empathy. I think I named it. I named it that like in 2015.
You didn't
And
name it after your dog's paws.
no,
Yeah,
right?
because he's
Yeah,
got some big. He's a big boy.
yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh. Yep. So yeah, I named it that then, and now I'm like, I don't really want people to practice sympathy. So I'm
Yeah,
gonna change that acronym at
right.
some point.
Well, I appreciate your time and the last, and it's completely out in left field, but I sometimes joke that I'm going to put together a podcast just based on all the odd references that I come up with. Rock and roll music, typically. I grew up in the 70s rock and roll era, although I listened to other stuff too. And when you talked about belonging, there's an Aerosmith song from their famous Toys in the Attic album. It's called Uncle Salty. And I think if I get it right, Uncle Salty told me when she was just a baby that she'd get by and maybe someday she'd see. But soon she found her mother's love for all the others, the pushers and the shovers, was a life to lead. But when she cried at night, no one came. So that
Mm,
stuck with me back in the
yes.
70s. That song stuck with me. Harry Chapin's Cat in the Cradle stuck with me.
Hmm.
Because I don't know why, but I tended to be that workaholic father that was featured there. And I sensed that when I was a kid delivering papers. So I
Yep.
draw inspiration from all kinds of crazy sources and would love to share that with people too. And I just wanted to kind of put that out there just to add a little flavor, a little salt, a little Uncle Salty. And but again, I was really excited to have you on here because I think you have a way of introducing this to the people that I am connected to on LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. So I'm going to say thanks a bunch. I'm going to wrap up here,
Absolutely.
and I say incrementally better, one thought at a time, one word at a time, one action at a time, one day at a time. So you've helped me and this podcast be incrementally better today, Jessica, and I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Robert.
Okay, thank you.
All
Bye.
right. Bye.